Welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Insider Briefings. We launched these insider briefings with the leading experts of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs in order to help you, the decision makers, the community leaders, and our professional colleagues in the United States, in Europe, and around the world make more informed determinations about the critical issues facing Israel, the Arab and Islamic world, and the West. And today, there is no exception to that rule. We're going to be talking about borders and the legal status of the disputed territories in Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank, the former West Bank of Jordan. You know, we're hearing determinations and claims made by the United Nations, the European Union, and international governments and politicians about the legal status of the post-1967 disputed territories known internationally as the former West Bank of Jordan, or simply the West Bank. These determinations and claims, in many cases, are based on misinformation and a lack of deep understanding of the legal precedents and issues and law surrounding the case. And what we are very pleased to do today at the Jerusalem Center is to bring two of the leading international jurists on these issues here at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Both of them fellows, I'd like to introduce them to you. Ambassador Alan Baker, former ambassador to Canada and the former legal advisor to Israel's foreign ministry. Very nice to have you with us, Mr. Ambassador.
Good to be here.
Irit Kahn, who is the president of the International Association of Jewish Jurists and Lawyers, and formerly you were the director of the International Division of Israel's Ministry of Justice. Great to have you with us, Ms. Kahn, as well. These are critical times, Alan and Irit, and they're very important context issues in order to bring to our supporters, to our colleagues, and to decision makers in order to make more informed decisions about what the nature of these territories are and what the status of these territories are. I want to turn to you, Ambassador Baker. You've been dealing with this as a former Oslo negotiator and a very internationally respected jurist and former head of Israel's legal division for the foreign ministry. What is the status of these disputed territories?
Look, I don't know how long we have, but the questions that you asked will probably take about 3 months to answer.
Well, this is a 3-month program, and I know the audience is tucking in.
Well, let's take one after the other. You said other territories Palestinian. First of all, the term occupied Palestinian territories, quote unquote, is a term that since 1977 has become accepted parlance in all United Nations General Assembly resolutions. It's used throughout the international community, but it has no legal basis whatsoever. There's never been a Palestinian state, and therefore the territories have never belonged to the Palestinians. There's no legal binding or even non-binding agreement, treaty, resolution, or any other type of document that determines that these territories belong to the Palestinians.
But yet you have the United Nations Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, that calls these territories, the West Bank, OPT, Occupied Palestinian Territories. Are we to understand that that is simply has no basis in law?
Absolutely no basis whatsoever. It represents the political viewpoint of the majority of states that voted in favor of more than hundreds of resolutions that basically say that, but it has no basis in law. The territories, as you introduced this discussion, the territories are in dispute. And this brings me to the next question that you asked about rights to the territories. The State of Israel and the Jewish people have got claims that are based from time immemorial, whether biblical claims or historic claims or legal claims, to this territory. One only needs to read about whether it's Jesus or anybody else who wandered around in this area 2,000 years ago. He was born a Jew, lived a Jew, and died a Jew. And historians refer to the fact that during that period there was a Jewish community here. So nobody can deny the fact that the Jewish people have got very, very deep and long roots and rights to this territory. Add to this the fact that in recent legal history, whether it's the 1917 Balfour Declaration or the 1920 San Remo Declaration, or the League of Nations Mandate Instrument, or the Article 80 of the United Nations Charter, which revalidates all previous declarations, they all acknowledge the fact that the Jewish people have got historical roots and historical entitlements to this area. Now, that's not to say that the Palestinians don't have rights and can't claim rights. They've been here since around 670 AD. In other words, over 1,000 years after the Jews arrived here, but they've developed rights over this period.
When you use 680 AD or ACE of the Common Era, let's say, we're talking about since the advent of Islam, since the founding of Islam.
Exactly. Islam came to this area in 670, and since then, in various places in the area, they've maintained a presence, and so they've built up an element of rights. But the Jewish people have got indigenous rights from time immemorial. The Arab people have a certain element of indigenous rights, but not as indigenous as the Jewish people. But this is a dispute. And the whole idea behind the term disputed territories, rather than Palestinian territories,
or occupied territories,
is to bring to the fore the fact that these territories are disputed. And in the agreements between Israel and the Palestinians, agreements which are still very much valid.
Are we talking about the Oslo interim agreements of 1995?
The Oslo Accords, the Palestinians and the Israelis have agreed that the final status of the territory will be determined through negotiation. Now, if the Palestinians themselves have agreed that these territories, this final outcome, the fate of these territories will be on the basis of negotiation, then how can anybody say that this is Palestinian territories or this is Palestinian occupied territories?
So what we're saying in short, from this very brief opening, is that to say occupied Palestinian territories or the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories is simply a political reflection rather than any kind of legal determination.
It's political, but look, occupied. The fact is that Israel entered the territories in 1967, established an administration over a population, an Arab population in the territory. So to a certain extent, Israel is occupying the area, but it's not occupation in the way in which international law defines occupation as being a situation that one state occupies the territory of another state. That's not the case. We're sitting in the territory physically, and we're administering the territory or parts of the territory physically. But we can't agree to calling the territories occupied, because in international law, occupied territory means it's occupied from another sovereign state. And this was never the case, neither with respect to the Gaza Strip, which the Egyptians held under some type of military administration, or the West Bank areas of Judea and Samaria, which had been conquered by Jordan and were never acknowledged by the international community as being part of Jordanian sovereignty. So there's no clear definition here in international law who is the sovereign over these areas.
So let's move from this debate over sovereignty to this notion of occupation, Attorney Kahn. Since the Oslo Accords and the more formal interim accords of 1995, 21 years, were they not intended to creating areas A, B, and C, to end any claim, international claim of occupation? And in fact, where Israel is not at all present in Area A, they're not responsible, the Palestinian Authority is responsible for security and civil relations administration. In Area B, there's shared control. And then, of course, Area C is under full Israeli administration. How is it that the international community calls Israel an occupier of all these areas? What then was the purpose of the Oslo Accord, and what is its meaning today?
I'll tell you, Dan, I think that I agree with Ellen a lot that there is misconcept of the whole situation. I can tell you from my experience that when I appear before an audience of youngsters or others abroad, and I tell them the history, as Ellen just said, of the occupied territories, they say, well, we didn't know about it. So the whole thing is used by the General Assembly from time to time in a different and not in a legal manner. But I think that what's influenced it and what is causing it is the fact that we are sitting there, not in all the areas as you identified, but we are sitting there for many, many years. And the international public is tired of this thing. So the tendency is, because we are the powerful part here in the Middle East, is to blame us. But it's not the first time that we are blamed. This is not a right concept. And maybe if what we are doing here will bring the people to look for the history and all the, I'm not going with Ellen to the 2,000 years. Everyone is saying to us, oh, we are tired to hear that the Jews were there 2,000 years ago. Well, it's a fact, so you could be tired. But all the legal decision afterward, they really wanted to give the Sumeria and Judea to the Jews because of the connection of it in the League of Nations, etc., etc. And the disputed areas were born at the resolution of the not the General Assembly, but the Security Council. So it's not that it's a United Nations decision of disputed areas. So if you ask me why the whole world is doing it, this is a question that we ask us the whole time. But mainly, I think, from my experience, and I've met many, many audiences, is ignorance and people that don't know. And you know what? It's not helping to build the peace. It's just putting it back. Because if we would have dealt with the right terms, I think that peace would be closer.
Well, here we have the similar problem on the issue of settlements. Settlements as a problematic issue or controversial issue are perceived by most in the West, and I don't think I'm generalizing on purpose, but from my understanding, by most people in the West, as being the major obstacle to diplomacy and peacemaking between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. What is the bottom line legally on the issue of Jewish settlements in the disputed territories?
Look, this whole concept of the word settlements as being having a negative implication is something that's been artificially produced over the years, especially by the Palestinian leadership, but also by the international community, based on a misreading of international law. The legal basis that's always used to determine the fact that they claim that settlements are illegitimate is the fact that in the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention, which deals with occupation and administration of territory, an occupying power can't transfer by force parts of its population into the territory that it occupies.
As the Nazi regime
exactly.
did.
This was drafted. Yes, exactly. This was drafted between 1947 and 1949, after the experience of the Second World War and after what the Nazis did in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, where they conducted forced mass transfers of population in order to change the demographics, in order to change the whole nature of the area. Now, rational legal commentators, international lawyers, agree to the fact that this was intended to deal with the type of activity that Israel is doing in enabling Israelis to live in areas on land which is not privately owned. International law, the the 1907 Hague Rules and the Geneva Conventions all set out very clear rules. What can a power that's administering territory, what it can do and what it can't do. And it's entitled to administer land which is not private land and enjoy the fruits of this land.
The Userfrucht.
Usufructus. Yes, absolutely. Which means that if there's an apple tree on the land, you're entitled to enjoy the apples as long as you don't cut down the tree. The same with respect to use of the land. As long as the land is not privately owned and there's a prohibition on taking private property, as long as the land is public land, it was owned by the former administration that was there, or it's municipal land or whatever, it can be used, and it can be used for agriculture, and it can be used for establishing towns and villages, as long as when the time comes, or if and when the time comes, and negotiations take place, and it's decided that this land goes back or reverts to either the Palestinians or whoever, then no legal title is established by the people who are settling in this land.
Well, the vast majority of people in the West believe, as our research has shown, that Israel basically has expropriated the land that's privately owned. I mean, this seems to be a misperception.
So this is I want to say two things first. First, what Ellen said about this Geneva Convention. This was the reason that Israel did not join the ICC.
The International Criminal Court.
The International Criminal Court. Why? Because this section that the majority of the Arab countries suggested said that people that are going out on their own volition to the place is a war crime. And this was interpreted not right after the Fourth Geneva Convention, who in the section said that only people that was made to go into this place, like after the Second World War, and this, because when Israel heard this in the Rome Convention, we decided that we are not going to do it, because it was very clear that the idea and the target would be that the settlements are illegal. Why? Because people went to sit there without force.
By their own will.
By their own will, and it was not what meant to be in the First Geneva Convention.
This was a clear manipulation by the. I was present during the negotiation of the International Criminal Court Statute in Rome, and this was a manipulation by the Syrian and Egyptian delegations, who deliberately took the terminology of the 1949 Geneva Convention and manipulated it and added wording in order that it would cover Israel's activities.
So is this the source of the legal differences between some international legal scholars upon which so many of these political opinions are based, that says Israel's very presence in these territories, Israel's illegal. Building is illegal. Yeah. That is the position of many international jurists in contrast to Israeli jurists.
So that position exists because in 1967, the International Committee of the Red Cross adopted that way of thinking, and all international opinion, legal opinion that claims that Israeli settlement activity is illegitimate is based on that principle, but it's never really been put to serious legal examination. And even the International Court of Justice, when it was discussing in 2004 Israel's building of a security fence, they made a comment, which is a sort of side comment, not a principle of law, saying, well, yes, of course, we all know that Israel's settlements are illegitimate. But they didn't examine the legal issue. They merely repeated claims that were made by the Palestinians, by the Jordanians, and by various other members of the international community that chose to make statements. But let me just stress another point. The issue of settlements is an agreed upon negotiating issue in the Oslo Accords. In other words, the Israelis and the Palestinians have agreed that settlements is on the negotiating table, in the same way that the permanent status of the territory is on the negotiating table, that Jerusalem is on the negotiating table, that refugees, security, water, and other issues. In other words, there are very serious issues on the negotiating table. Now, the United States, the United Nations, the EU, the Norwegians, the Egyptians, the Jordanians are all signed on the Oslo Accords as witnesses. So how then can the Secretary of State Kerry come along and say settlements are illegitimate when the United States itself is party to a signature on a paper that says basically, well, this is a negotiating issue.
Now, when you say it's a negotiating issue, it means that settlements are mutually agreed during the period of the Oslo process by both the Palestinians and the Israelis. In other words, it was not considered, it was not a point of argumentation.
It was never discussed.
It was never discussed.
No, I took part in these negotiations, and the issue of settlements was never discussed, and it doesn't appear in the agreements. The opposite, in fact. It says specifically that in the areas of control and jurisdiction of the respective parties, in other words, the Palestinians in areas A and B and Israel in area C, are free to conduct planning, zoning and construction in accordance with their basic legal principles, as long as they don't harm the environment. That's the only proviso.
But we have to add another two things, Aaron. First of all, there is a consensus in between the Israelis that when we speak about, and Alan said it, but I want to stress it, about private areas of the Palestinians, we should not be there. And people should go out of there. I think that I can say 99% of the Israelis agree about it.
And the government, all governments have enforced that prohibition, have they not?
Yeah,
including
enforced.
the Israel Supreme
Yes,
Court.
some people say that not fast enough. We have to be honest and realistic about it, but this is a consensus. Secondly, when we speak about terms of life, many Palestinians who have a lot of economical problems, let's face it, without Israel it's very difficult, they work in the settlements. And now the BDS movement, we have to say it very clearly, what they try to do is to say, for example, that things that are coming from the settlements out of Israel are illegitimate, which we don't accept. But what they are doing, in fact, they take the work of many Palestinians that are working in those settlements and take just the money that they can bring to their homes. So this is another thing that, that the world doesn't look at it in this way. The main thing is just not to do it and to say that people of the settlement cannot come to the world, etc. They are not speaking about how many Palestinians are suffering that they can't bring their home the money that they would like to.
We do know almost 1,000 Palestinians on this point have lost their jobs in Area C of the West Bank. They're legally, technically called settlements, but they're actually commercial industrial zones that were set up in order to encourage peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I want to take you to the final discussion point in our Israeli JCPA insider briefing, and that's the legality of borders. Now, Israel doesn't have any eastern borders, but in fact, this is a major disconnect between what is well known in Israel and what is less known in the West. Help us understand.
We have to remember, Alan, before you start, we have to remind the people, maybe they don't know, that at 48, Israel had to be a very, very little state. And the Israelis accepted it. There was a discussion here in the yeshuv, I don't know how you say yeshuv in English. Community, but okay. And the Arab countries started the war. This is a thing that everyone forgot, and the Arab countries never took responsibility for it. They didn't miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, as Abba Evan said a long time ago, okay? Had they accepted it, Israel would be a very little country today, and they would have all the areas that in the division, in the partition, they really had to accept. But they didn't accept it. So there was an armistice line after the war in 49. If you want to go on, so go on.
No, exactly. There's no such thing as a 1967 border.
Nothing.
And so anybody, including Kerry and Obama, who've been persuaded by very, very articulate and clever Palestinian propaganda that Israel has to withdraw from all the territories to the 1967 border, quote unquote, It's completely false. There was never such a border. As Irit said, there was an armistice demarcation line that existed from 1949 to 1967.
Exactly.
In 1967, during the course of the Six-Day War, Israel entered the territories, and so what remained was a 1967 line, which was a ceasefire line based on the armistice line. Now, in the armistice agreements of 1949, there's a specific provision that was put in by Jordan that says that this armistice line cannot be considered to be a border. Borders can only be negotiated and agreed upon by the parties concerned, and they can't be imposed. So when the United Nations in its resolutions, or when the Secretary General of the United Nations or Secretary Kerry talk about the fact that Israel has to withdraw to the 1967 border or lines, there's absolutely no legal basis to this. And they're undermining another negotiating issue, because borders is on the negotiating table. And it takes two to tango, and it takes two sides to negotiate a border.
What in your two views, in the view of both of you, has been the fallout or the effect of Israel's refusal, essentially, to make this type of point publicly or even privately in negotiations, in discussions with its American ally or with its European allies about these particular legal determinations?
I don't know if it was, the first word that I would like to say as a redhead is stupidity, but I haven't been there, so I really can't know. Maybe they did, and it was not accepted, I don't know. But I think that it should be really said and told widely in the world to understand it.
You know, as a former diplomat, and I'm no longer a diplomat, so I'm free to say what I want.
And play the saxophone.
And play the saxophone, and some of your questions are more difficult than my saxophone playing. But look, I've written letters to Kerry, and I've written letters to the EU, explaining legally why they're wrong. Why doesn't the state of Israel argue this type of thing? Because we're talking to our best friends. And when you talk to your best friends, you can't be overly critical. You have to be diplomatic. I don't have to be diplomatic. Irit,
me too.
He's even less diplomatic than me.
All right.
That's why we get along so well. But you know, in international dealings, especially when you have a best friend who supports you and who you want to continue to support, you have to be very choosy with respect to the issues that you want to argue with them. And that's why I think Israeli diplomacy is overcautious. And sometimes I think we have to argue our rights and not hesitate and not be afraid.
Well, that sounds to me like a perfect summary to a complex legal discussion about Israel's rights in the disputed territories and the status of territories, borders, and settlements, because these are really the sticking points and the misconceptions in so much of the free world that I think we at the Jerusalem Center, and both of you, of course, are distinguished fellows of the Jerusalem Center, and Alan, you're the director of the Center for Contemporary Affairs, beyond all of your other distinguished titles, that we will continue to have these discussions with the international community and with the Israeli community in multiple languages in order to lay out once and for all what Israel's legal rights are and the legal rights of our Palestinian neighbors, as well as the obligations of both sides, as we try to make a pathway to progress to lead us to diplomacy, peace, and goodwill for all peoples. Thank you very much,
Dan,
both
can
of
I
you.
say one more word?
The last word. We said ladies first, now we say
Exactly.
ladies last, Mr.
Always,
Ambassador.
always.
Ladies last.
When I was in the Ministry of Justice, and we used to prepare a trial in the Supreme Court, I used to take all the lawyers in the department and to tell them, I want to hear the facts. Not what you heard and not what he said. I want to know the facts. I believe that if the world will see the facts, it will be easier to come to a conclusion. That's what I wanted to say.
There we have it. Ambassador Alan Baker, former ambassador to Canada and former legal advisor to the Foreign Ministry, and a wonderful saxophone player. Thank you ever so much for joining us in this complex discussion. Irit Kahn, the current president of the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists and the former Director of Israel's Justice Ministry's International Division. Thank you both for joining us. We hope that we've given you some context and perspective on this very troubling and complex issue, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon in another edition of JCPA Insider Briefing. Thanks for joining us.